So we have time for some questions, and we'll collect 3 or 4 questions, and I wonder if anybody will raise their hand, and somebody did before I even stopped. Please, go ahead. The mics are coming. Microphone is on the way, and then second one is Binayak.
Oh, were you going to go? Oh, okay.
Okay, then there's the third one.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think having other actors in the development space, like NGOs and other stakeholders, working in all of these different sectors, how does that complicate this sort of process of getting greater government accountability?
Go ahead, Keynote.
All right, yeah, thank you again also on my part. This is a really brilliant presentation. I really hope we do so much more work along these lines. I'm also in IFPRI. One question I had about information and the power of information is, what is your sense on when and under what circumstances information matters, even if it is actually diffused and reaches the citizens? And so you had given the example of Uganda, and just to also relate a quick example, field sort of interaction that I had with some of my IFPRI colleagues in rural Uganda, where we were relating and discussing an information intervention that the government is ongoing undertaking. When we shared that information with them, they kind of laughed in our face and said, what's the use of information? Even if we have this information, what power do we have to change what even local leaders can do, leave alone what national political leaders can do? So under what considerations does information actually matter at all?
And then right here, Vinayak.
Thank you, Shanta. You mentioned about the market failure and the government failure, and you seem to seek the solution for the government failure through better connectivity with civil society and better information flow. The problem is of the later model is that it presupposes an active civil society class, middle class, and I would argue that much of the deterioration which you see in the recent years is because middle class is exiting from the public service delivery and seeking privatized service system. So your comment on this, please.
And I'll take one more right now. PK? PK Joshi.
Thank you very much. I'm PK Joshi from South Asia office from New Delhi. Really enjoyed your presentation. And my question is basically on health and education sector, which you are revealing, and every government is concerned about health and education in India. So do you mean that government should withdraw from health and education sector, or there should be some sort of private-public partnership? Or do you think that it's a complete policy failure? Because as you rightly mentioned that there is an education sector, absence of the teachers, no recruitment of teachers in the schools. So what is the solution specifically in education sector? And health is also a really, really critical sector. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, okay, thanks very much. These are great questions. And let me try to tie the first and Binayak's question, what about NGOs, and civil society in general. It is very important points. Obviously, we should work with civil society, but there are at least 2 things to keep in mind. One is, I would say roughly civil society groups in most of our countries fall into 2 categories. One is as advocacy NGOs. They advocate for certain causes. The other is as service delivery organizations. Like BRAC and others. And sometimes they get the 2 combined. And I think that's the difficulty I've often had. I think we should be working with the advocacy NGOs because that's exactly what they do well, is actually reaching the poor. Now, they may be on one particular area, but if we can get information out there in the way that they do, there's a possibility. On the service delivery, and again, they deliver services extremely well, and that gets to a little bit on the India side as well. But on the other hand, that's a different function, and in many cases, they're trying to promote their service delivery model, whereas what we're trying to do is to give the information out to the public so they can decide which service delivery model they want. And we have to be careful on that. Now, just taking it one step further with Binayak's question, I'm not sure you need a middle class to make this work. Remember, there was no middle class in Uganda. Frankly, there isn't one even today. But there wasn't much of a middle class in Uganda back in the 1990s. And they were able to make some progress. I mean, not full-fledged. I mean, you're right that the symptom is that the symptom of the water in India is that the middle class, they dig their own wells and have their own sources of water, which means that they don't have the political interest to go in and fight for universal access to water. And that's a problem. But I don't think you need a middle class to actually mobilize poor people to demand what is their due. It does get to the point, the question, the other one though, just giving them information isn't enough. Because as they say, I hear this all the time, what can we do? What do we do? And this varies quite a bit across, shall we say, across scores on the Polity 4 category between autocracies and democracies. There are different levels of what you can do. But I don't know whether we should fine-tune this. My view is there's no clear linear relationship between getting the information out and getting a result out the door. Frankly, when we did the study on leakage in Uganda, we had no idea what this was going to do. We just wanted to find out what the leakage rate was. So I think we just need to move as much as we can and get as much information out there as possible. And I'll give you one sort of example or case where I think it can work, or it's more likely to work, is when the government objects to your publishing that information. Right? That absentee study, the teacher absentee study, the Indian government did try, I mean, in their own way, try to get us to stop doing it. I mean, they didn't say don't do it. They said you need the signature of the additional secretary and the joint secretary of every state that you're working in, and usual. And that told me that we were onto something, right? So I said, no, sorry, this is a research project. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence on teacher absenteeism, the probe study and everything else. It's time that somebody does a systematic study, and that's all we're going to do. And so we just went ahead and did it, even though the government was objecting to it. And again, it had that impact because even though the Indian government objected to the study, that map I showed you, the former prime minister put it on his website after we developed it, because he saw it as a way of holding the chief ministers of different states accountable for performance. So he figured out that this was actually in his interest to have this. Now, finally, on the health question in India, when I give a presentation like this or related presentations in India, especially to the Indian Medical Association, you should try that someday. It's really fun. They always say, "Oh, you're trying to privatize the health system." Not at all, right? I say, I mean, if I felt like being rude, I say, you have already privatized the health system, right? Right? Because, curative healthcare is 80% private in India, right? And it's higher among poor people than among the rich, right? Because the public sector has failed. I'm trying to restore some semblance of efficiency in the public sector, so you won't have people don't have to resort to the private sector. Now, how do you do that? You were asking for solutions. I think it has to come, there are different instruments, but it has to be something in which the doctor is accountable to the patient. That's the one, it's very interesting. We talk about healthcare in the United States and Europe and the National Health Service in Britain. You look at all of the OECD health systems. They're all different. But in all of them, the money follows the patient, right? This is the one thing that doesn't happen in India, right? So all I'm saying is, I'm not taking a stand on whether it should be private, whether you should have the US-style private health insurance or the British National Health Service or the Bismarck model in Germany or whatever they call it, right? Just have that principle that money follows the patient. And you can do it through vouchers or something like that. And that may be one way of actually holding these doctors accountable.
That was an excellent start for the questions and the answers. Let's take another round of questions. I'm going to get, please say your names later, but I think Katrina. Yeah, okay. Shanta's picked Karen as well, and then Ephraim, and then go ahead. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Katrina.
All right, great. Shanta, thanks for that presentation. I'm wondering what you think about the relative promise of these bottom-up interventions, like the ones you've talked about, where people have information, they use that information to improve service delivery. One thing that strikes me about those is the fact that it requires faith that government will not manipulate information, even when it has an incentive to do so, and also that people understand how to use that information, as some of my colleagues have touched on. I'm kind of wondering about the relative promise of those types of interventions versus more top-down interventions. Say the national government saying that the budgets to subnational governments are going to be based on relative performance, or absolute performance, or improvements, or something of that nature. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the relative promise of those two methods.
Shanta, thanks very much. I'm struck that you seem to be much more optimistic about the role of information in poor or developing countries than I think we have reason to be about the role of information in our own political system. So I'm wondering why that is.
Ephraim?
Ephraim.
And
Yeah.
please say your name.
My name is Ephraim. Just a comment. So a comment and a question. A comment is, I liked your study in Tunisia. Please do the same study in Angola. Now my question is this. You talked about this tracking monopoly in Africa. And one thing which is very sort of confusing to me is that you in your study, I was studying your paper last week. The trucks are very old. And if you want to know what I mean, drive behind one of them. You'll know what. So why are they operating such old trucks? Why they get such big profits?
Thanks. My name is Purnima Menon. I'm a senior research fellow and based in IFPRI's New Delhi office. I thought your presentation on in effect, the people who are the frontline providers, whether it's in the education system or in the health system, was really interesting. And you really speak about it from an accountability perspective. But when I'm thinking about, I'm wondering if you can also speak about it from a performance support perspective, because what you're looking at is people in extremely poorly resourced infrastructure environments who are poorly paid themselves, and a lot of that local level corruption, absenteeism, et cetera, is happening often just from the perspective of how do I make for myself a living wage that enables me to have a decent life, whatever that life is, right? So how can we think about public service provision from the perspective of enabling public providers to achieve what they need in their daily lives, as opposed to this, they're doing a terrible job, they're so corrupt. I mean, we just haven't set them up for success from a performance perspective. And now we are going after that last line of people from an accountability perspective. So I see a real sort of contrasting issues here.
Okay. Boy, questions are getting harder. The first, Katrina's question, we had two parts to it. I mean, one is that governments can manipulate information, absolutely, which is why I think this information generating activity has to be done by independent authorities. This is, and this is somewhat controversial even at the World Bank, I have to say. But I really do think that it's precisely for this reason that because there's also all this rhetoric at the World Bank about ownership and we want to build capacity in government and all of that. Which is all good things, right? But I think there has to be some level of independence to maintain the credibility of this information. And I think that's a role for international agents to do. I mean, the external agents, like IFPRI or like the World Bank, actually both have more resources to devote to this, but also have that independence. You don't necessarily have a political stake on, between the two ladies in Bangladesh or something like that, but rather this is just objective information. That said, the other thing to be very careful about is the academic quality or the rigor of this information has to be impeccable. Because the people you're trying to reach don't have the ability to discriminate between fake news and the correct. I'll get to Karen's question in a minute, but just to prepare you, right? Now, how to use this information? Yeah, it comes back to the earlier point about what kind of tools do people have to exercise accountability? And it's not just the ballot box. I mean, obviously the ballot box is there, but there are other ways in which, and you can look at communities that actually do it. I mean, they do get up there and protest. In Kerala, a doctor doesn't show up. It's very interesting. In Kerala, a doctor doesn't show up in the clinic, and a mob goes and grabs him from his house. Right? You've created an ethic. In part of this, maybe this gets a little bit to Purnima's question as well. Part of this is when absenteeism becomes a norm, that people aren't embarrassed by the fact that they're absent from their job, and they look around, everybody else is absent. That's a low-level equilibrium. And what we need to do is to get to a higher level equilibrium. Because what I said about people showing up for work, it doesn't matter whether you show up for work or not, you get paid. That also applies to IFPRI staff, right?
Maybe
not. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, it certainly it certainly applies to the World Bank. Right, but somehow people do show up, right? Because it's a norm. And people who violate it are considered not good people. So I think we have to go from that low-level equilibrium to the higher-level equilibrium, and that's what maybe these information campaigns can do. Now, Karen, I think Karen's question is actually a very important one. I've been thinking about it lately, and I know that officially I'm not supposed to have to pronounce on U.S. Economic policy, but I will. No, I think what's going on in Europe as well as in the U.S., this sort of rise of populism, is precisely what's been going on in developing countries for the last 30 years. I mean, it's really interesting that all of these issues, the water crisis that I was talking to you about, is very similar to what's happening now in Europe and in the U.S. Right? So it's not that it's not that the role of information doesn't seem to be working in the U.S. is that you've never had this problem not never, but you haven't recently had this problem. They had populism back in the 20th century, early 20th century, but now it's come back in a different form at the moment. And I think we do need, in the U.S. as well, to get truthful information out there to the public. Just take the case of migration. I'm talking mostly in Europe. There's no shortage of solid empirical evidence that migrants actually benefit the labor market. They pay more in taxes than they use in public expenditures. They commit fewer crimes than natives. There's robust evidence out there. Right? That's not what you hear in the rhetoric, which is classic populism. Right? So we have to get that information out there in some form or the other that actually speaks truth to power in these times. Ephraim's question, by the way, you said please do this in Angola. We would love to do. We would love to see these things done in all sorts of countries. Unfortunately, at the World Bank, we can only do it when the dictator has been deposed. So we did it in Tunisia and Egypt. And then we shared our methodology with the Economic Research Forum, ERF, and they have done a study of covering the rest of the MENA countries. So they've got Jordan, Morocco, Iran, Lebanon, and a few others. So be happy to, if you want to do something on Angola, because I think it really is important to get this rigorous evidence out there. Now, the trucks are very old precisely because they don't need to be modernized. They're going to make a lot of money anyway. So they don't need to, there's no competition. Usually you want to have a better truck so that you can compete with your fellow truckers. Let me just tell you one anecdote. I never believed this story about monopoly truckers because I couldn't believe they could sustain it for so long. So once I was in Cameroon and I met these truck drivers and I talked to one of them. I said, you know, you're charging this price. Why don't you charge a lower price, you know, for a bulk order or something like that? And he said, I did. I tried that. They burnt my truck. It was a $100,000 truck that was destroyed because he tried to break the market. So this is real. Now, let me, and are we closing? Is this,
Keep going. One more on.
Oh, well, I had a nice closing remark in response to Purnima. Remember I mentioned.
You can hold that and then
No, but it's relevant to Purnima's question. No, I think you raise a very important point, and we should have some perspective here. Well, first of all, you raised one point which I don't quite agree with, is that it has to do with the low pay of these frontline workers. Because, you know, all the studies I've seen where you have a public sector and a private sector, the public sector pay is much higher, of the order of 4 times as high. So somehow to say that these people are underpaid when you've got private sector people, including NGOs and everything else, working at a quarter of that pay and showing up for work, makes me think that it's not exactly about their pay. That said, I want to agree with you that we tend to interpret this or over-interpret this as an accountability problem, whereas it could be something where they lack the support, not financial support, but the moral support to be better frontline workers. And this came home to me when we were doing this work on community participation in schools in El Salvador, the EDUCO program. You know, there was a program where the parents used to visit the school on a regular basis. And we find that there was an improvement in student learning outcomes in those schools that the parents visited, and, you know, randomized control trial and all of that stuff, right? And so you could interpret that, and my first instinct was, aha, so the parents are monitoring the teachers. The teacher shows up because the parents were monitoring them. But we did a case study where we interviewed a whole bunch of these teachers, and the teachers actually said, no, that's not it. You don't understand. When the parent is in the classroom, I feel more empowered because I know the parent is paying attention to the children's education. I feel it as a collaborative exercise. I am inspired to work harder with the children because I know the parents also have a stake, are exercising their stake. So I think you're onto something there, which is that the sort of crude accountability notion might be missing what's really going on there, even though what we observe is this relationship between monitoring and better outcome, that mechanism could be very different, particularly in the education sector.
So, okay, a very short round. We'll get 3 questions, and then and hopefully they'll have quick answers. And I'd like some questions from the cheap seats in the back. Anybody?
The same price.
Okay, from the expensive seats in the front. Derek?
Yeah, Derek from IFPRI. So I think your point about these sort of soft incentives in morale and stuff is very important. I lived in Chile in 1998, and something incredible happened there. Police were getting low pay. They didn't protest. Their wives protested. And the police cordoned them off and stopped them protesting. It was quite incredible. It went on for months and months and months. And their morale was, you know, they had pride. You know, they said, you know, we don't complain, we're not corrupt, and they're sort of an enigma in South America. But I also was sort of wanting you to talk about exemplars, you know, some more positive stories. So in East Asia, you know, they've got corruption, but bureaucrats there and low-level frontline workers seem to have done good work too. And I'm wondering, what's your interpretation of that sort of story? Certainly in the old days when people were talking about East Asian miracles, you know, they had rewards for people as well as sticks. And if you've given any thought to sort of systematic rewards for low-level workers.
Somebody, okay, please, your name too?
Is it on? Yes. So I'm Fleur Woutersen with the West and Central Africa office. And I just wanted to come back to the discussion about populism and migration, of course, being a European Union citizen. And I was wondering, you're saying that populism can actually be somehow a mindset can be changed when you provide people with these facts about migration actually not being a, what you call it, like a disadvantage to a society in economic terms. But what I experience from Holland and from the rhetoric that's going on is that actually people will not respond to that information because it doesn't translate to what's going on in their own environment, and it also doesn't enable them to play this blame game where they say, okay, you know what's going on, we need to actually have someone to blame this on. And so when you come and say, oh, we got this study and we can show actually this is not the case, it doesn't hit home. And so I'm just wondering if maybe this is not the right way to actually try to change that mindset.
And one last question. Okay, here you go.
Okay.
I missed it. Okay, two last questions.
Hi, Ruth Meinzendick. Actually, just picking up on that, I'm wondering to what extent this idea of objective information is not necessarily the way to go in terms of understanding people's identity and ideology. So it may be the idea of an appeal to the identity of a dedicated frontline teacher. Or, you know, there's these studies about firefighters in the US that if you offer them extra money, they're offended because, no, this is who we are. And so I'm wondering if you've got any examples of using identity and ideology as an instrument.
All right, yes, I think, thank you, Shanta. I think the bottom-up decentralization, PPP, the privatization, all we have tried. But I think we still need some sort of much more radical, even transformative agenda to really provide service to the poor. I'm wondering what will be the role of the leadership. Now, particularly through some of the peer-reviewed mechanisms, you know, the African Union launched several initiatives, CADAP, the Malabo Declaration, where they really put heads of the governments accountable to 6 or 5 or 6 key indicators, peer review, the data connected, verified by a third party. So all this bottom up, yes, you have mentioned, it's great to push, but I'm afraid the speed is too slow. Can we do something dramatic, something truly transformative?
Shanta, you get the impossible task of answering those questions in 4 minutes.
Okay.
Because we're out of time, but please, go ahead.
I think the first was about East Asia, the contrast with East Asia. And that's a good question. But we have to look at, and I've looked at this, the East Asia case in light of this framework. And I think what's coming out very clearly is that in East Asia, I don't think it was all the industrial policy stuff that my friend Justin Lin talks about. It really comes down to that they have ways of avoiding government failure. It's not that it's the intervention or not. And I'll just give you 2 examples. I mean, infrastructure basically was priced at marginal cost all the way through, from the beginning. So you didn't have the kind of water scandals that you have in India. Even education. I mean, they were charging, in China, they charge for primary education. In Vietnam, they actually charge both informally and formally for primary education. Now, some of us would say that's horrible, but Vietnam has PISA scores that are off the charts. And again, it may be due to lots of other factors. I don't want to say it's just because you charge for it, but whatever it is, they don't seem to have the problems of teacher absenteeism that we see in these so-called. So, you know, the socialist countries are the ones that charge for education, and these market economies are the ones that try to give it out for free. And so, you know, they're very careful. And the other thing in China, I mean, Schengen must know this very well, is that they're able to stop and change course on a program very quickly. So they embark on some innovation. If it doesn't look like it's working, they switch in a way that I've never seen in any other country. And and I think that's another way of avoiding government failure, is that, you know, what did Einstein say? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result.
I've been given the 2-minute sign.
Yes, yes. On the populism question, see, I would push back in the sense that I'm not sure we have actually like blanketed the European public with this information. It's still seen as a sort of niche academic thing. It's what economists sit around at the European Economic Association and discuss, rather than getting it out there in the newspaper, in the radio, in the television on a day-to-day basis. I don't see that. Now, that said, I think you have a point, because what concerns me is that it looks like even that information, even if it's completely absorbed, may not change the position, because people might be voting on things other than their enlightened self-interest, or even their economic self-interest. That's what seems to be going on, because if you look at patterns of voting, you know, in Europe, what you find is that young people, the old people, who are the ones who are likely to benefit from migration, are the ones most opposed, and young people, who are the ones who are likely to lose from migration, are the ones who are supportive. You know, or like in Switzerland, you find that these communities that voted against migration in that referendum are the ones that have no immigrants and have never seen one, you know, in their lives. And Geneva and Zurich voted for immigration, which is where all the migrants are. So there's something else going on here. And this might get to Ruth's question, that it is identity, or it is they're literally voting against their economic self-interest because it's in their identity's interest. Now, if that's the case, I don't know how to manipulate that, and I don't think we should, right? I mean, I'm not sure we actually know how to do that, and I think it's dangerous, because I think we have to maintain some certain principles. I mean, I like to think that I do research on things that would improve human welfare. And that's what I continue to believe as the principle behind what we put out. If I'm going to sort of say things like, well, you know, this is going to make the blacks better off and the browns worse off, or something like that, then that's very dangerous for us to play into that game. Finally, Schengen's question about transformative. You're absolutely right about leadership, but I would add one other thing, which hasn't gotten enough, I think, enough press, which is it's not just what the leaders at the top do, which is, frankly, I think some of these peer review mechanisms are not that much faster than some of the things that I'm talking about, right? And we know what the African peer review mechanism, how long it's taken, and the results are not great, including in countries that were initiating it, like South Africa. But what I think we need to look at is not just, given who we have as leaders, how we can get them to do a better job, but who gets selected as leaders. What is the process by which people actually run for office? How do we get people who are genuinely interested in the public good to stand for office and then get themselves elected and then be able to do something? And there's some work, you know, the guys at Berkeley, Frederick Finan and guys have been doing some work on the sort of selectivity of leaders. And let's talk about leadership that you talked about at the local level. It doesn't have to be only the central government leader, but you could have, good people or well-meaning people who are trying to run for office at the local level. They might be the ones who can actually then bring about this change. And that, I don't know whether you call that bottom up or top down. I mean, it is increasing, strengthening the pool of accountable leaders that we will have. And to get there, I still think you need the citizen engagement. That is what's going to give us those leaders.
Shanta, I think this has been a great session, and we really want to thank you for the presentation, for the discussion, for coming to IFPRI.